Hey everybody, and thank you for tuning in to Blitzkrieg Pop edition number 38, Sounds Irish, Acts Global, which is the title of a book recently published by Equinox and authored by Michael Murphy, who is our guest today. Hi, Michael. Nice to have you
How are you
again
doing?
on the show. Yes, the last time we had you on the show, we were celebrating the publishing of another book of yours, Punks Listen, published by Hope Collective, a collective based in Dublin. This time, Sounds Irish Acts Global is available for order on equinoxpub.com. So the full title of the book is Sounds Irish Acts Global, Explaining the Success of Ireland's Popular Music Industry. And I'm added to your title and its various parameters and paradoxes. It has a strong emphasis on the individuals and the entrepreneurship behind the development of the Irish music industry within the global context. But before we get into more detail, Michael, could you maybe perhaps briefly tell us what made you write this book, but also describe a bit the unorthodox approach you took to writing this book, and how you found the DIY approach that we're familiar with the punk movement has always been a direction of choice for the Irish involved in the music industry? Just maybe a global general introduction.
Yeah, the book came out of, I guess, my direct experience with the Dublin punk DIY scene, but also my experience with the global major label music industry. I worked for major labels. I worked for Virgin. I worked for a label called Imago that was set up by the man Terry Ellis, who had founded Chrysalis Records. I then managed bands. I had an act signed to every one of the major labels, so all five as there were then. And then I thought, what haven't I done? I haven't signed a band to Disney. So I did that. And then I thought, okay, I've done it all. I thought I can stop now. So it really was born out of that duality, that those two strands that I've experienced directly, the DIY, the cooperative music scene. And I try and distinguish between the music scene, which is DIY, and then the music industry, which are the major labels and its contracts and its ownership. So I guess my approach was really informed by the fact that I see both of those things and I go looking for them. And I met with my co-author, Jim Rogers, who's a complete expert in how the actual global music industry works. So I thought Jim can cover that brilliantly. And I think that's one of the strongest chapters in the book is the chapter where Jim looks at the current state of the global music industry and how concentrated it is. I think it's more concentrated than people sometimes realize. And that then freed me up to look at the granular. You can see the DIY in punk, but I thought, was there DIY in Enya? And I approached
Yeah.
it out of just blind curiosity. And then I thought, well, there won't be any in Westlife or Boyzone, so I'll be able to say they didn't have any. And then, oh, hang on. Actually, there's very, very significant DIY activity by teenagers, by young people. And we tend to think that there are stylists and choreographers and Svengalis and major label experts who kind of shine up five people and then get them ready for the world stage. But I was amazed and surprised and pleased and felt an urgent need to document the fact that you find that DIY activity even in acts that don't appear to have anything to do with DIY.
Yeah, and that's I think it's a very original idea. And as you mentioned, I heard you say the word, so the name Enya and maybe Boyzone. Today, we're probably not going to talk about the usual punk bands or punk related characters, but we are bearing three things in mind. I think the fact that the Irish spend a lot of money on music. U2 is one of the main, I'd say, economic exports of Ireland. I mean, I hate to talk about people as exports, but in terms of money, that's the truth. One of the largest selling artists in the world. And also the fact that the economic and political circumstances of Ireland have been such that a diaspora has settled in both the States and in the UK. And I think unfortunately, as you two for a long time have been considered as a British act as well. And, I think the Fontaines DC also have that thing that people think that they come from Britain because, but Ireland is this very specific island stuck between the UK and the USA, and it's always a kind of a battle to assert your sovereignty, so to speak, economically as well as politically. And I think your first chapter was very, very interesting because it showed the progressiveness of the Irish abroad and their sense of enterprise. So I think the first chapter of your book is called Early Stage of the Music Industry. And I think maybe I'd like you to talk to us about a character called Victor Herbert and his contribution to the development of that, Irish music industry abroad.
Victor Herbert is a fascinating character, and he's generally now not included in the Irish music history because his music was of that time. Now it has dated. But at the time where he was popular, Victor Herbert was a superstar. And he was a superstar in America at a time where economically, the US was the most successful country on the planet. And we had this guy who was very, very invested in Ireland, in Irishness, in popular music. And he had a huge, huge media footprint. He was incredibly influential. Because of his popularity, because of his fame, he was able to talk about things that mattered to him. And one of the things that really mattered to him and that he was very passionate about was Irish independence. And I think people forget or didn't know in the first place that the two biggest ethnic groups in the US in the 1910s were the Irish and the Germans. So you can imagine the tension when World War I arrives on the global stage. And, Britain is obviously saying to the US, you've got to come in. Like, this is our battle. But there are two very, very significant ethnic groups in the US who are thinking, if you do go in, well, maybe it's not so clear what side you would go. So Victor Herbert, again, he was of his time. So he certainly publicly stated that he thought, this is, World War II, it's going to put Britain in its place. It's going to allow smaller countries like Ireland to experience independence. So he was absolutely pro-German. Now he was of mixed Irish and German descent. So he was very, very typical of a certain group in the United States. And he was a huge pop star, and he was a very significant figure in the Irish independence movement in the United States. And he, that one of the moments that I tried to highlight in the book was the fact that in the British Parliament, when Britain ruled Ireland and Irish parliamentarians went to London, we had in Ireland a lobby who thought songwriters should have rights. And T.P. O'Neill sponsored a bill that established by law the rights of songwriters and the people and publishers, the people who own the songs. That's really big. But what's much bigger is that Victor Herbert does that in the United States. And it takes a couple of court battles. It takes a number of years. But Victor Herbert is the individual who spearheaded that drive to protect songwriters' work and to protect publishers' work. And the supreme irony is that the law case that decided that people should be paid when their music is played in restaurants and places, that case was against an Irish restaurant in New York. So there were Irish on both sides. And Victor Herbert, he always said, I'm a son of Ireland. But he never set foot in Ireland. He claimed that he was born in Dublin, but he'd never been there. But it was that presentation of Irishness and the advantages that brought within the Irish community, which was large, but also the fact that he could have identified as English and maybe he would have had an even bigger career. But he's a fascinating character.
Yeah, and I think you highlighted another fascinating character in this regard, Aileen O'Byrne and the Shanleys family as well. Both, I was reminded of when you were talking about them, the Shanleys, of an era where women were not allowed to go to restaurants on their own, and the Shanleys were obviously a very progressive family. In promoting live music and how they treated women in their establishments. Maybe you'd like to say.
Yeah, and again, that was a surprise to me, finding out more about the Shanleys and about the scale of their enterprise. These were people who left rural Ireland, post-famine rural Ireland, with literally nothing. And they established themselves. They did, what's known as chain emigration. One brother goes, he makes enough money to live in New York, sends the money home to bring the next brother, and eventually most of the family end up in New York in the restaurant industry. Yeah. And, these weren't small diners or cafes. These were prestigious dining establishments. The length of, if you've been in New York, the length of a block is a huge piece of real estate. That was the size of the Shanley's restaurant. And beneath that, the length of a block was their wine cellar. So they were phenomenally successful. They mixed with the highest and the lowest. And at that stage, the lowest were the Irish, who were just off the boat. And in particular, Irish women who did jobs that even other immigrants wouldn't touch. So would have been very uncommon for an Italian woman to be a nanny, because the idea of looking after someone else's children in their home was, we might be poor, but we're not going to do that. Whereas the Irish did. And again, when you see that Irish women, and you mentioned Ellen O'Byrne, to me, who's the great hero of this story. Ellen O'Byrne is absolutely the great role model. And to me, she's the founder of the Irish record industry, yet she doesn't really appear in the history. And, if I've done one thing with this book, with Jim, it's reinserting key people. And I think there's no one more key than Ellen O'Byrne.
Yeah, I think you think of her as the godmother of Irish recorded music. I think that's the right way to describe her. The other thing you were talking about, which I could relate to as well because of my interest in Sean O'Casey and Juno, the play Juno and the Peacock, you say that the advent of the gramophone had a huge impact on Ireland. And of course, one of the things that they acquire when they get a little bit of money in Juno is the gramophone. So featuring big on the theatre stage, it's a sign of wealth when you get the gramophone. But yes, so back to Ireland a little later, we see that maybe things were not that free on this side of the Atlantic, and that a key element of the Irish music industry development was the jarring relationship between the global cultural industries and the advent of jazz and the guardians of what you say that you call the guardians of Irish morality. Because after all, as you point out in your book, young people and jazz were more of a danger than Britain itself to Ireland. So maybe, I think another important character and legislation that ensued from it in a way is Bartholomew Gough. I presume that's the way I pronounce it, right? Anyway, yes, so I'd like you to explore maybe the relationship between what was thought as dancing music and really dangerous, and the recorded music, which was kind of safe.
Yeah, I'm delighted that you've seen and identified that point. Live music, dancing in particular, dangerous. Recorded music, safe. And that's an incredibly interesting way to look at a piece of culture. We think of music as music, and music gets recorded and it gets used in a certain way. But the way that music on record, on shellac, the old 78s, they were used, was very, very interesting in Ireland, in contrast to dancing. And draconian laws were enacted to prevent people from dancing. At one stage, you couldn't have a dance in your house. It was against the law. So things that had been part of the rural life, your neighbors helped you with the harvest. How did you reward them? You had a dance in the house. You pulled back the chairs, you pushed back the table, and you had dancing in the house. No, suddenly that's illegal. The very, very basic act of dancing is put outside of what's accepted behavior. And Bart, as I call him, but Bart Gough, Bartholomew Gough, sometimes he used his Gaelicized version of his name, Justice O. Haycock. He really, really hated the idea of people dancing with any form of liberty or any sense of freedom. So we've got a female entrepreneur in New York who's left Ireland, who establishes a very successful business. We've got the Shanley brothers who leave rural Ireland, go to New York, establish restaurant industry where women on their own are welcomed, in contrast to the policy in the 1910s, the 1920s, where, single woman in a restaurant, that means prostitution. Never mind that, in one famous case, it turned out, no, it's the wife of one of the wealthiest industrialists in the country. So it was just seen as odd. So in New York, the Irish were part of this incredible progressive movement, bringing cabaret, which is seen as, just an ordinary part of the entertainment landscape now. The Irish, the Shanleys, were absolutely a central force in making that a big industry. But back home in Ireland now, there was serious worry. There was concern. How do we protect our Gaelic customs, our Gaelic language, our traditions? How do we not be British? Because British culture has been forced on us. So I've got great sympathy. I can really understand Justice Bartholomew Gough's mindset, and he was a revolutionary figure. He wasn't sitting at home during the independence struggle. He was active. But when he became a district justice, with hindsight, we can see that his approach was very strict, was very severe, and ultimately it was untenable. It's very, very interesting. It's what the great theorist Stuart Hall talks about, this mutual siege that different groups in society, they're looking for position, they're looking to express themselves, and sometimes it's not one wins and the other disappears from the field. It's a mutual, constant siege that never stops. This battle for meaning, this battle for expression. But Justice Gough hated dancing. There's certainly evidence that he didn't know anything about it. And he was challenged in court. The anti-jazz movement has been very, very well documented by brilliant Irish historians. But I was wondering, well, where did it get challenged? How come dancing is legal now? And so I wanted to see where the pushback began. And the deeper I went in, the more Justice Goff was a person of interest to me. And I don't know if it's a supreme irony, but he's buried in Dean's Grange Cemetery within sight of John McCormack. And I always find that an amazing moment when I go down. I'd like to go to visit both of their graves when I can. And here's one of the first global pop stars from Ireland. And here's someone who really thought that Irish people couldn't be trusted to dance, to organize dances. So DJ Goff went very, very hard. He was very
DJ,
restrictive.
right? DJ.
Yeah. So DJ, District Justice Goff, he wouldn't allow dances to go on late. He wanted initially for a set amount of the time to be given to Irish dancing. Now, that happened in other places as well, but it became very, very common for the judges and for the other people, including the Gaelic League, to think, hang on, if we force people to do Irish dances, they just have a laugh. Like, they're not actually doing Irish dancing. They're just, it's disrespectful. But DJ Goff's big contribution, I think, to the morality of Ireland was the case, which I hadn't seen, Danielle. I'd never seen it documented before, the case of Julia Clark. And he didn't want people dancing, but it was more than that. He didn't want young people socializing, and he encouraged the locals in Blackrock, County Louth, to set up a vigilance committee. And the vigilance committee in Blackrock, County Louth, saw a couple kissing. And so they went to the guards to say, oh my God, you won't believe what's happening. There's a boy and a girl and they're kissing in public. The guards say, oh my God, we've got to do something. We'll go to the parish priest. Parish priest said, okay, this is serious. We've caught them. Anyway, Julia Clark, who appears to have been born in Ireland, but was part, you mentioned emigration and what that actually means to Irish culture and the culture of music. Julia Clark was living in Scotland. She was home in Ireland on holiday, and the case went in front of Justice Goff, and he fined the boy. And the only reason he was able to take this legal action was because Eamon de Valera had introduced a clause in the Constitution that anyone who offended values, it was a very, very vague piece of legislation that was added in the mid-1930s. And District Justice Goff was the guy who took the test case. So he was establishing the legal precedent for it. And the guy was fined a couple of pounds because he was a local. He was from a good family. He had no previous. Now, Julia wasn't a local. There was nothing mentioned about her family, but there was this taint of woman living abroad. And so she was fined. She wasn't fined. She was sentenced to a month in prison. Incredible diversity of treatment of man and woman who are doing the same thing. And basically she was told, get on the boat and you're banished. So would she have served a month in jail? Yes, that was hanging over her, but she never served the month in jail because she was basically told, you'll spend a month if you ever dare to come back to this country. Incredible.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to quote you on page 40, I'll just give you the quote because I think it's just so, and it'll allow us to move on with the emigration, because it's so important, I believe. You say the overzealous policing of dancing in Ireland had a major consequence. It stunted the growth of the domestic music industry, and it meant that Ireland was dependent on overseas record companies. For decades, many of the best of Ireland's music entrepreneurs reacted to the heavy-handed policing of dancing. They emigrated. And in this regard, I think the next chapter, the global music industries in Ireland, you give us some insight. I think Jim gives us some insight and some more important statistics. It's full of really telling statistics. And maybe I would like you to develop the idea that I think throughout the whole chapter you develop as Ireland being the most globalized country in the world, and therefore acting as a contour, a counter. So I think that it's very key to understanding the role of the diaspora and the limitations of what happened in Ireland as a result.
Yeah, I think Jim's chapter is a really strong piece of work. I think it's a great achievement because it not only shows how the global music industry functions and grows and develops through mergers and acquisitions, where power is concentrated in a never smaller group of people. And for a small country like Ireland, which has a very, very Ireland has a really complex relationship with the global music industry because we've done incredibly well. You mentioned U2, but one of the biggest rock bands in terms of sales of the last 60, 80 years. There's a band that emerged in my lifetime. And unlike pretty much all of their contemporaries, they kept a sales plateau globally when, the other bands that maybe started out with around that time or had something similar, like the Teardrop Explodes or Echo and the Bunnymen or the Mighty Bois, like bands that were written about in the same magazines by the same writers. U2 are the most extraordinary success story. And clearly all of the other bands that anyone has heard of globally have generally benefited from the fact that the major labels are very good at taking certain acts and exposing them to a global audience. But this idea of a comptoir, this idea of Ireland being almost a pond with a really rich ecosystem, and occasionally a major label will see a little fish in there, and will make it a global success. Now, there are problems with that economically. One major label, when they sign you for life. In fact, for your afterlife as well. So generally the ownership of your masters, of your actual recordings, of your publishing, if you've signed a publishing deal, that goes out of Ireland. And, we've had Irish book publishers look at the great Irish films. Now, a lot of them have received funding from abroad, but they're still Irish, whereas we haven't produced enough. Now, do we have Irish record labels? Yes, we do. Do we have Irish record labels produced fantastic music? Yes, they have. From Ellen O'Byrne to Terry Hooley and Good Vibrations to the Chieftains and Clatter Records, to Any Other City, to the new hip hop labels, the new punk labels. But we don't have a huge export from any of those labels over a 40-year period. That means that we've always been dependent on foreign expertise, foreign capital, which generally has assumed ownership rights, and we've then lost a huge portion of the income. Now, there's no easy solution to that, although I would certainly advocate we need more DIY. We need to encourage more DIY. We need to encourage more people to think, yeah, we could set up a record label. We can put on gigs. We can form a collective. So we could set up a publishing company. So I genuinely think that Ireland has a double disadvantage. One is that we don't have domestic labels that compete. And two is that we don't develop DIY enough. And that idea of a comptoir that we're just an outpost, that we're seen by the major labels in the same way that Newcastle is, except we've a bit of a branding halo where,
Yeah.
if something's Ireland, you can say, oh, it's the next U2, or this will appeal to you because you like Enya, or you like, Guinness or Shamrocks, like sometimes the Irish abroad have been marketed in that way. But I really think I would urge anyone who's in a band, who's a DJ, to read Jim's chapter very, very carefully, because it has very, very big implications for the Irish.
And it's not like, just want to add about this chapter. It's not like Ireland has not implemented any kind of infrastructural methods for harnessing and developing local talent, because I think you might want to talk to us a little bit more about the Section 2 of the 1969 Finance Act, and maybe the development of radio stations in Ireland as well, which, did promote. But is that strong enough to fight the market forces? That's what it comes down to.
Well, here's one way of looking at it. If you can turn on an Irish radio station and you're really passionate about Irish music, the question for you is, do you think there's enough Irish music on there? And if you feel there isn't, then there's a further series of questions to be asked. Radio stations, their job is to play music to make a profit. They're generally owned by companies, and their legal responsibility are to the shareholders. So it's literally not their job to promote Irish music. And they don't do it. Why would they? They cannot afford to put on a record that jars their listener out of, oh, it's great to hear that Rihanna song again. Oh, Taylor Swift, brilliant to hear her. Wonder what they're going to play next. And if they suddenly play Paranoid Visions, a lot of people will switch.
Yeah.
So the radio stations are a subset of the music industry. And the music industry is actually the music industries. It's the recording industry, the studio industry, the radio industry, and how they all function together to advance Irish music. That's very, very tricky. And to be honest, just now, even the socialist governments haven't got it right. You can't force people to make pop music that sells, and you can't force entrepreneurs to take an interest in music, which sometimes has a very, very lengthy payoff before you actually turn a profit. Yeah. But we have done some very, very notable things and we do lots of things, Ireland on a state level, to encourage music. And the question for people sitting in Ireland or anywhere else, if they're interested in Irish music, is enough been done? Because that'll vary for everyone. And I'm not the sort of person who would tell people how they should approach, what they listen to. Because there's, music is freedom. But there's a longer consideration. If we stop producing bands of the stature of U2, artists of the commercial stature of Enya, and, both commercially and artistic, there's a huge, huge loss to our cultural life, to our economy, to all of the spillover things that happen. If U2 are the biggest band in the world, how many people in Ireland get jobs, as their crew, as their publicists, as their wardrobe people? There's a huge, often uncounted economic benefit to very, very successful artists. And it's there's no easy solution.
And
but it's something that
Yeah, I think it's a bit frustrating too for Irish people, Irish punters, when their band go abroad. Then you never see them again because they're busy touring America and the UK, and it's very difficult to see them in Ireland. They only play one gig if you're lucky a year, and and then you have to travel if you want to see them. So that's just a little bit of an aside, but it is frustrating as an Irish, and probably for you too, as somebody who's gone to 5,000 gigs, difficult to see the people you like on your own territory. But back to the 1950s in America, Elvis and the development of something which I really was a discovery for me, because being French, of course, I don't have this culture. What you call Ireland's Catholic pop. This is just an amazing. This is a great title, absolutely fantastic title, very intriguing, and the importance of the Ed Sullivan Show, both by introducing Elvis to the Irish audience and the whole world stage, but also introducing Irish Catholic pop to America. So I think it's well worth spending a little bit of time telling us about the little Gaelic singers and their impact.
Again, this was the sort of thing where if you research deeply into a topic, you'll find things that you didn't know anything about. And I remember discovering this and just the thrill. I felt like I was an archaeologist who had just unearthed some treasure, because Elvis is seen as this progressive, exciting, dynamic force who met a lot of resistance at the time because people thought, oh, that's gone too far. Oh my God, we've got to censor him. So there was a big campaign to censor Elvis. And yet he appears on arguably the biggest entertainment television show of the time, Ed Sullivan Show. This isn't the old grey whistle test. This isn't 2 o'clock in the morning, much music playing, alternative music. This is going into American households, American heartland. And if you had a whole show of Elvis Presley, you might have lost viewers. You might have had people think, oh my God, that Ed Sullivan, I thought we could trust him. And now look at him. Look what he's forcing on us. So the counterbalance, when Elvis appeared for the second time, were the little Gaelic singers. And they were a group of Irish. They started off in an orphanage, St. Columcille's up in Derry. And I believe the quote from Ed Sullivan is, aren't they the darlingest little children? So it was an alibi. It was a musical and cultural alibi for Ed Sullivan showing Elvis. It was the counterbalance. And the little Gaelic singers, it was fascinating because, again, it shows, well, who were the managers in Ireland of music acts who were able to get a record deal, who were able to get their acts going on tour. I know that you're the sort of person, you get upset when the bands you like tour elsewhere because you want to keep them for yourself. But the little Gaelic singers were a huge phenomena in the United States. We've got the massive diaspora, but there's also a Catholic presence beyond even the Irish diaspora. And they were singing nationalist songs. They were singing hymns. They were singing Little Ireland Irish ditties. So it was this fabulous moment where it was almost a Trojan horse of values. That you put these little kids, everything's, oh, they're so lovely, aren't they cute? They're adorable. They were wearing the little Irish dancing outfits. They used to do a little bit of dancing. They were, the musical director was very, very talented, so it wasn't that they were bad. It's just that they were very, very, very identifiable with an image of Ireland as being a little backward, a little innocent, a little simple, a little pure. So it was all of that, what Edward Said would,
Wholesome.
call
Yes.
othering. And yet they were a big visible export. Now, they weren't huge in Ireland. They were an example of, okay, sometimes you can send stuff out from Ireland and it will find a more receptive audience abroad. And they toured the United States regularly. They certainly had an audience. Decca Records signed them, released their records, promoted their records. And on the sleeve notes of the records was basically an endorsement for Irish Catholic orphanages. So that's why I invented this term, Catholic pop, Irish Catholic
Yes.
pop, because I was looking for a way to explain the influence of the church until quite recently on our popular music industry. And I thought, actually, this is a very, very interesting way of looking at the power of the church. Now, sending a group of orphans on tour in the United States, that must have been a thrilling adventure for them. But let's put that in the historical context. And we know a bit more about the historical context because people have started looking into the mother and baby homes, into the industrial scale export of babies from this country.
Really.
That
Yeah.
was done by the Catholic Church rather than by the state. So again, what my argument is that the Catholic pop was a demonstration of how sophisticated the Catholic Church was, that they could get the major global record labels to actually promote Irish Catholicism and the Irish values as being, okay, the Irish, they're Catholics and their children are innocent and they're looked after by nuns who dress them up and then send them on tour singing
Yeah.
religious songs, nationalist songs. So if I'm a Catholic nationalist in the United States, I think, oh, they're singing, Irish, essentially rebel songs,
Yeah.
but they're singing Catholic songs as well. So, okay. So those two things are definitely being reinforced.
Yeah.
They're reinforcing
So
each other.
a new form of missionaries or mission work. And I think what you just said about this really shows a certain state of mind. And then we get into bands that took the bull by the horns by advancing the do it yourself approach and enterprise on the Irish music scene. And there seems to have been some what I call the Malcolm McLaren touch or tactics behind Horselips. And yeah, so I think you talk about Horselips, a major Irish band. I don't know if people remember Horselips, but I mean, major Irish export at the time. Not a band who we would associate from the outside to the DIY approach, but I think of all the bands that you've described, they certainly seem to be an incredible band for applying these methods and by necessity. But maybe the whole thing started with a gig cancellation, so I think that's kind of they were from the get-go aware of the relationship between the band and the media, the image that they had. So maybe I'd like you to explore that phenomenon.
Yeah, Horselips, you know, clearly one of the most important bands in Irish music history, without doubt. But I think people haven't really acknowledged how important they are in the enterprise of music. They were incredibly savvy. They were, I love that you mentioned Malcolm McLaren in that context of Horselips, because it was that situational approach that, okay, we could go and record great music, but how do you get attention for great music? That's the eternal struggle. And they thought, well, we'll use all of the smarts that we have. So their records looked fantastic. And the show band records didn't. The artwork on the show band records, it it was primitive at best. Now, some of the Irish labels like Gael Lynn, they had fabulous really sophisticated artwork. But Irish popular music didn't generally come beautifully packaged. It came loaded with gimmicks. And horse slips to the conservatives would have looked like a gimmick. To the people who love traditional Irish music, they would even have looked a bit dangerous and unruly and even a little bit degenerate because they weren't playing Irish traditional music straightforward. They were making it rock. But the enterprise behind horse slips is actually just as interesting as their musical innovation. And they were able to tap into that sensibility. And maybe they were even able to push that conversation about, hang on, the 1960s was about freedom, allegedly. We had Woodstock, we had the hippies, we've Bob Dylan, we had the civil rights movement. So how come things in Ireland feel so conservative? They feel so static. They feel that the traditional power groups are still in control. And so I think quite brilliantly, Horse Slips thought, well, the way to get a bit of controversy is to look like local priests, think that we're a threat to young people, that
Yeah.
we're going to lead them astray. So, but by our standards, it was very, very turned. But even putting a word like aphrodisiac on a poster, at early 1970s, late 1960s, that Ireland hadn't that big countercultural shift that other countries had experienced. So horse slips were really, really innovative and really exciting at the time. And they absolutely proved that an Irish band, and famously U2 became the exemplar of this, but horse slips proved Irish band can stay at home if they're business savvy enough. They can stay at home and deliver fabulous music if they retain control. So they set up their own record label, Oates Records. They brought the Rolling Stones mobile recording studio over to a big Irish country house. Ireland was a very, very poor country in the 1970s compared to other European countries. So there were big houses available. They brought bales of stray, bales of hay into that country house to help the sound. Interestingly, one of the people who's paying attention, who's got a front seat to development of horse slips, is Paul McGuinness, who then later goes on to manage U2. So I think Paul McGuinness saw what horse slips could do, and that was the example he followed with U2 to obviously huge success. But the huge, huge, huge brilliance of the DIY enterprise of horse slips, I think, hasn't been celebrated enough. And that could be a model that could be revisited now by someone who was savvy enough.
Yeah, I will talk about you two just in 1 minute, but I think what you just talked about, in more generally speaking, I think for Irish bands who, and I think a lot of Irish musicians are trained in the traditional mold, and every time a band tries to broaden that mold, there is a lot of criticism in Ireland. It's very difficult for Irish traditional musicians to do something else than to escape the tradition. So I'm thinking about somebody like Damien Dempsey, who really, is very inspired by Bob Marley. But it's, it would be really interesting to study his model of, because I think he also jars, and I think every traditional band, Irish traditional music band that has tried to break out of the mold has been quite successful, despite a lot of criticism, and they've had a battle on their hands. And I think horse slips maybe were the first ones that were pioneers in this domain. And The Man Who Built America is an album, as you mentioned, about emigration by a band that managed to stay at home. And you go on talking about the huge success enjoyed globally by U2. But in your opinion, what I wanted to ask you about is what were the components of the DIY method that basically they got inspired. I think you mentioned Paul McGuinness. What were the components of the DIY method that allowed for U2's success? And maybe on a side note, how some people really missed out on the boat on U2 as well. But I just wanted to ask to say on a personal note, I came to Ireland around the time when U2 were becoming successful. I had seen them in Paris. I'd actually talked to Bono in Paris because I knew Pete Wiley at that stage. And if you recall, in the press, it was always, Bono against Bono, Bono against Pete Wiley from Wah. But anyway, I remember in those days that there were some, and I think you point as well to this phenomenon. U2 were almost not part of the Irish punk scene. They were aside. They had a parallel trajectory to bands like the Virgin Prunes, despite their links with the Virgin Prunes, and we'll talk about them a little later on. But it was just, to say that they, in my mind, in my experience, they were parallel to the other Irish bands that we talked about, by the way. At the very beginning of Blitzkrieg Pop, we did 2 programs, one about the north of Ireland and one about the south, and how different the parameters were for both scenes, so to speak. But anyway, back to the DIY components of U2's early success and who missed out on them. And yes, because we don't really associate U2 either with a kind of DIY approach.
I think that's very true, and I think it's quite a dangerous misreading of U2's enterprise, of their long-term success, is to sideline the granular help that they received early in their career. Young bands need help. They need supporters. And, there were some really significant things even before Paul McGuinness became involved. And great example, Adam Clayton had the managerial role. He had business cards. This was a really, really young band, but they were trying to take a business approach. I mentioned in the book that The Edge's mother, Rolling Stone described her probably laughingly as the band's first roadie, but it's very significant that at that era, in that punk era, 76 to 1980, that very few women in Ireland could drive. And very few women in Ireland had a car. And even fewer women in Ireland who had a car would have driven their son and their mates into Dublin to put up wallpaper paste with handmade posters. So the DIY, I think, is really, really important. Another DIY moment that's of huge consequence to U2 was that local journalist, Bill Graham from the Hot Press, sadly deceased, but an incredibly astute chronicler of popular music. He took U2 under his wing. And it was he who lobbied his friend from Trinity College from the Ents days, when Bill Graham was involved in Ents and Trinity, and said, you've got to see this band. This band could really do it. But he took a bit of convincing. But again, it was that DIY. Bill Graham was looking for, and if you manage them, I want 5% or 10%, or I want something out of it. It was just, I'm in the local scene. I've seen a band on the local scene that are really good. They need help. They deserve help. How can I help them? The other huge supporter of U2 in many ways early on is Steve Averill. And he just thinks, these are good guys. Their music is good. I'm a graphic artist. I'm an intelligent person. He was in the Radiators from Space. He did their graphics that look fantastic. And, he gave them advice. He gave them their name. And again, he wasn't, look, if I give you a good band name, I want 5%. This is what happens in the DIY world. People help each other. Now, you mentioned U2 and punk, and they don't really fit, but you've got to realize that there was no punk movement with a lot of momentum in Ireland, because in the first major punk gig with bands from both sides of the border, a young guy, Patrick Cooltree, was stabbed to death. So punk went very, very underground. And it really is in post-punk that you see the gift of punk. And the gift of punk is do it yourself, challenge things, see if you can be creative, see if you can do something that's a bit purposeful, a bit different, express yourself. So we in the South, very, very strange relationship with punk during those 4 key years globally. Northern Ireland, different story.
Yeah.
But U2 absolutely benefited from that local support. They were noticed by a publisher in England, a guy called Brian Morrison, and he said, "I'll give you a publishing deal." And I think this is great, and that'll pay for us to go to England, and we'll do shows around London, and hopefully record labels, will get interest in us. And just before they were going to go on that trip, he said, now I don't know the exact figures, but I know very close to what they are from what the band and the manager spoke about. It was around 2.5 grand he'd offered them. And then he decided to drop it, possibly by £1,000. And the band said, no, absolutely not. So they turned down a deal that they had agreed to because the person wanted to adjust it by a few £100s. Now, the amount of money he lost is fascinating to even think about. We don't know what portion of U2's publishing he would have owned forever, but we do know that he lost it based on trying to save a couple of £100 from this Irish band that he felt, well, they have to take the deal because I know they don't have any money. So the only way that U2, this is how poor they were, U2 were only able to do those gigs because Bono's girlfriend's parents lent them some money, along with some of Paul McGuinness's friends that he knew from college, including Tiernan McBride, who I think was Sean McBride's son. Wow. And those people lent money to these young guys who were making music, and there was no way of telling whether they'd ever turn a profit or not, but it was done out of that DIY goodness.
Let's do something positive.
Let's do something. Let's help some. They're trying, so let's support them. And then the other huge moment is Phil Chevron from the Radiators from Space. He's in London, and there was another trip again funded by Alison Stewart's family, Bono's girlfriend at the time, who became his wife. And Phil Chevron introduced him to people, including the person who then gave U2 the first magazine cover before they had a record deal. So the generosity, the no strings attached approach of DIY, the community spirit was of huge consequence, and it saved U2 from signing a portion of their publishing forever for a couple of grand. Now, what happens is that U2 signed to Island Records eventually, thanks, I think, to their stature brought about by the DIY community in Ireland, and they and obviously their music as well. And they signed their publishing to Island as well, because most record labels didn't want to sign U2. They thought they weren't going to pay off. And later, Island couldn't pay them the money that they owed them. And because of that, because they were signed for publishing and their records, they got their publishing back. Now, there's no better gift in the music industry than getting the publishing that you've signed away, the portion of your songwriting rights that you've signed away. And all of that happened because of the generosity of the DIY community.
Yeah, and I think you raised that point a little bit later on with a band like Westlife. You talk about, it's about like signing, we all know that it's the Faustian dilemma of signing your life away, and more than your life away when you sign a record contract usually. But so in the Republic, in the south of Ireland, uh, basically you point out that you two were starting a real model for DIY, which was really followed in, in that period, or maybe more common in that period, 1976 to 1982, which Ireland was a site of, I think you say, innovation and enterprise. And you talk about these young people. I think you're talking about your generation of entrepreneurs and who could cope with these new forms um, of Irish culture. And who are these people? I think I'd like you to talk more specifically about people like the Hope Collective and somebody like Michael McCaughan, who is one of the people who really changed the terms of, the way bands were playing and where they were playing and who had access to them and which band could have access to venues that maybe they wouldn't have accessed without these people, and that made them key individuals.
Yeah, and Michael McCaughan is a great example of that DIY. So here's a guy who's not in the music industry because he's just the entertainment officer. It's a student union position elected by students. So he's not a full-time salaried member of the music industry. He becomes the ENS officer in Trinity. There's no money. The budget is gone. And he has to do things on a shoestring. But McCaughan had a vision that I want everyone in Trinity to be entertained. I want everyone in Trinity to feel that I, as the ENS officer and the team around me, have put on something that will bring them joy. So it wasn't specific. I love dance music, so we'll have a great year of dance music for me and my mates. This was a guy who loved the Virgin Prunes and the Cramps and Danon. He loved Irish traditional music. So he put on a load of concerts. And it wouldn't have been easy because there was no budget. So you're relying on favors, and then you do enough things and they generate a bit of money, and then you've got a bit of a budget. But he was phenomenally successful. And he gave opportunities to unsigned Irish bands because he felt they deserved support. And, maybe clubs wouldn't put them on, or maybe they'd no following, so they didn't belong in a club. But, he famously put on Fiachna and Liam from Hothouse Flowers to do traditional Irish music concerts above the front entrance of Trinity College. I remember people who were bringing over French students would pass by under the front arch of Trinity. Yeah. So, before Hothouse Flowers were Hothouse Flowers making money, they were people gaining experience because of people like Michael McCaughan. He put on some of Cry Before Dawn's early gigs, and he thought, here's a band from Wexford who like the Psychedelic Furs and probably the Clash, but they've got uilleann pipes, and they're this amazing fusion. So he just saw bands that he thought needed and deserved support. There were bands like the Golden Horde. He championed Paranoid Visions, Those Handsome Devils, the Pleasure Cell. Five Go Down to the Sea he put on with Stars of Heaven. And then famously he puts on the Pogues. The first Pogues tour of Ireland isn't with a major promotions company. It's with it's DIY. And that's fascinating. And it's also really important because there was a time where the ENS officer in Trinity, or UCD, or Limerick, or Cork, or Galway, was a very significant force in the development of the music industry, but they were only generally there for a year. It was an elected position. So they were amateurs. They were from the DIY side of things. And I think, more needs to be researched and written about people like Michael McCaughan and the other entertainment officers, because I think they revolutionized the Irish music industry, and they were from the DIY side of things.
Yeah.
And then another huge stage, it's the Hope Collective. It's a bunch of young people who decide the bands we like don't come to Ireland. And famously, they write to John Robb from the Membrane saying, why don't you come to Ireland? And he writes back, says, why don't you ask me? And they were like, okay. And they did the gig, and it just built to incredibly to where they were able to sell out the biggest, or one of the biggest rock venues in the city, the SFX, when they put on Fugazi, Chumbawamba, and local band In Motion. They were there that as Therapy were developing. So when Therapy were an independent band, the Hope Collective put on their gigs, but as soon as they signed a major label, they said, we still love you, we'll buy your records, but you can't do any of our gigs. So sometimes there was certainly a famous case where Therapy then had to be the roadies for a different band.
Yeah.
But it was an extraordinary moment where it showed that small countries like Ireland, small scenes that don't seem to have a lot to do with the major labels, that with enterprise and innovation and dedication and care and a sense of fun, to be honest, young people can do remarkable things. And or older people, new entrants. When I say young people, it's really my code for people who don't think they belong in the music industry, or that the music industry is scary or organized. And the Hope Collective put on Green Day's first Dublin show, which is remarkable.
You've got some great anecdote about the SFX, Green Day, Courtney Love in that chapter. I think maybe you could tell us about the Green Day gig, because I think that was quite funny to read anyway.
Well, the Green Day story is really interesting because it's something that 30 or 40 years later still matters to Green Day. And they, on one of their recent trips to Ireland, they're playing Marley Park. So they're playing to a huge crowd.
Huge.
And on the day, they went down the docks to the site of the White Horse Inn, and took photographs and said, this is our first gig. And they kept the flyer, like this handmade flyer that these kids in the Hope Collective had made for the gig. And they said, oh, it's now a Starbucks. And, they kind of were joking, oh, we should bum rush it and, and do show there. But they also recalled, they were interviewed by Hot Press and, about what they remembered for those gigs. And Billy Joe talked about, like, it's the only time in our career where we said, okay, it's brilliant to be here. We want you to have a great time. But do you mind not moving? Do you mind not jumping up and down? Because we've been told that the ceiling might give way if anyone jumps up and down. So, they said that the place was a dive even compared to the dives that they were playing in California at the early stage in their career and other places in Europe. And that kind of shows how much the DIY scene matters, because there weren't great venues in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s in Ireland. The facilities for encouraging young bands were very, very lacking. But yet these people like Michael McCahan and later Edwina Forkin and Jim Davis in Trinity, and there were some great entertainment officers. Elvira Butler in Cork had preceded this with the Arcadia, which was dry, an alcohol-free venue that used to get 1,000 people every night, that she ran gigs, and she put on, the Cure famously, as well as lots of early U2 gigs. So I think that the entertainment officers, and then people like the Hope Collective and other collectives that have come along subsequently, have a huge, 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 but under-acknowledged role in the development of what is a very successful music industry today.
You do say that the industry and the scene have something in common. And I think it's always, these two words are the scene is for non-profit, for creativity, industry for profit. But they are driven by people, as you see, just said about those ENTS officers. Absolutely. They're driven by people, but they're driven by driven people. They're relentless. These people are relentless. And, I think Enya is a character who really, you wouldn't really associate her with any kind of DIY. But I think it's, what you show in that chapter is that she really is punk, fits in the punk model in a way, because she just debunks any kind of ready-made ideas about her, and was very savvy about maybe keeping her private life to from her public persona. I mean, is it a manufactured persona, the reclusive person, or the ballet between, no, I'm not a reclusive person, yes, she is, and so on. So she's an interesting character, and you know, not not somebody who is created by the record industry, but shows really genuine creativity and innovation. So maybe you'd like to say a little bit more, and particularly since she's a woman within that industry, her place in the Irish music industry.
Okay. You mentioned punk and Enya in the same sentence. Now, I didn't, so that's on you. But it's a very, very interesting point. And one of the most interesting comments that I've got on the book is, I was going to skip the chapter on Enya because I'm not interested in her. But I read it, and it's the most interesting chapter in there. So people who thought, I know what I know about Enya, and I don't want to know anymore, and I don't find anything about Enya interesting. That suddenly changed, like it changed for me, when you start digging down. And Enya is absolutely, I deliberately took a quote from someone who's a central figure in the music industry saying, Enya wasn't created by the music industry, because this was an incredibly organic growth story. Enya is one of the most successful female solo acts in history. And in Ireland, I think she's not appreciated for, people don't realize the level of success that she's attained. That she's sold more records than Green Day in the States. More records than Janet Jackson. People who'd be seen as superstars of their genre, and to me they are. But Enya is extraordinary because when you look at all the circumstances that needed to be in existence in order for this very introverted person to become a global superstar on her own terms. And again, that's quite uncommon that a woman in the music industry at that level of popularity, there hasn't been a single shred of compromise in any decision that she's made. Like, very, very few artists can say that. And it's because Nikki and Roma Ryan, who are her, Nikki's the producer, this incredible producer who brought this artist into a sonic landscape that I think Enya didn't anticipate. Maybe Nikki had a bit of a vision about it, but it was certainly, in terms of someone being a multi-million selling artist, no one globally had done that before. And to have the sustained career that Enya has enjoyed, no one else has replicated that in that genre. So it's remarkable from that point of view that the mythology is, oh, she's so mystical and she's so dreamy and she's so out there, and she's a woman of complete mystery. And then you look at, well, how come she was keeping a diary that was then published during her early success, where she was clearly involved in every decision about her career. And by the way, a career that then turned out to be the career of one of the most successful female artists on the planet. So there's a lot to be appreciated about that DIY. A major label wouldn't have invested in Enya. And we know that because where's the successful Enya that was dreamt up by a major label in California or New York or London or anywhere else? It just hasn't been replicated. So there's something extraordinary about the combination of circumstances and ingredients that had to go in to make her very successful. And you mentioned traditional Irish music in Ireland. And Nicky Ryan came out of the traditional Irish music background. And our traditional music, the enterprise of traditional music in Ireland, especially the more adventurous side of things like the Bothy Band or Planksty or even Day Dana. The enterprise behind those was more sophisticated than the enterprise behind the show bands. And the show bands never exported. There's a lot of mythology about Joe Dolan's success and the first Western artist to play Russia, which is a crock. It's untrue. Cliff Richard had played there before, but Cliff Richard didn't want people to know because it was, I'm only there because there's nothing else going on. Whereas over here was, oh, he's huge because he's played in Russia. But the enterprise of our traditional music, because these people were working, they were touring the States, they were touring Germany, Clonard were breaking, out of mainstream continental Europe. So there was a savviness, there was an exposure to the global music industry that was very, very sophisticated and brought a huge educated component to the Irish music industry. And out of that comes Nicky Ryan. And I think I mentioned in the book some of the quotes from Faughnó Ceallaigh, who later managed Sinead O'Connor and Boomtown Rats and Bananarama and people like that. And he was working with Clonard. He was a great supporter of Irish bands, and he was touring around. He was the manager, and Nicky was the sound technician. And he saw a genius in Nicky for manipulating sound and for understanding artists and the market. And there's the famous thing where at the trad gigs, people would clap along. They might have had a few pints to be clapping along, and then you couldn't hear this incredible, beautiful, sometimes subtle music and the melodies. So he'd bring, Faulkner was saying that with any other sound person, they'd just make the band sound louder. But Nicky thought, no, I'll just turn the band down to almost zero. So they're almost acoustic. So people have to stop clapping to listen to it. But he was also a great experimenter. He was a brilliant, brilliant technical engineer with oodles of imagination. And he worked with Clonard. I think there was a certain frustration at some level that maybe Clonard could go a little bit further if they were a bit more experimental. And Clonard didn't agree with his vision. So he left at the same time that Enya, who had been a small part of Clonard and a recent part, and he just took this, the most unlikely global superstar, the most unlikely global success story, and made her into just that, into a multi-million seller. His wife Roma does the lyrics, and they've got this setup that's allowed an artist who doesn't even tour. Again, that's almost unprecedented for someone to sell that quantity of records, to not tour, not have to deal with all of the messing that goes on with life on the road, and who I genuinely think hasn't had to compromise on a single atom of anything to do with her career.
And I think you say in the book as well that she's very clear about that fame and success are two different things. And she's been extremely clever in managing this concept, I think. Another example of solid organization, even in a small market, is what happened to the Corrs, who, and maybe we can talk about the importance or not breaking the US market. And I think they're a prime example of a very successful band who, relatively speaking, did not break the US market, but nevertheless became extremely successful on their own terms.
Yeah, the Corrs could be one of the most, I got to say, one of the most dangerous case studies in the book. Dangerous because I don't know if that position exists anymore in the current music industry. I'm not sure that a band that didn't break America would be tolerated by the major label system. And I think it's worthy of study for that reason alone, but also for other reasons. And you keep putting punk rock into some of these moments, which is a great way to insert something that we think we know something about, punk rock and DIY, and then the chorus. You think, well, where does DIY or punk rock come into things? But the chorus evolution absolutely gets a huge boost by Roddy Doyle, by the Commitments, by them going to the audition for the Commitments. And the Commitments film is made in Ireland because the book is about Ireland. And the chorus don't exist before the auditions for music for that film. So would the chorus have been discovered if Roddy Doyle hadn't written the Commitments and the film hadn't been made, especially if it hadn't been made in Ireland? I would argue there's a good chance that the chorus may never have been heard of. And there's your punk rock moment in the chorus, is that the publishing press that publishes Roddy Doyle and Fintan O'Toole and other brilliant authors is inspired by punk rock. And, someone in Finglas thought, okay, so there's bands that begin their bands in a garage in England, because, the Clash were famously singing about garage land. And thought, well, sure, I can do a book publishing company here in Finglas. And so it's really, really interesting when you trace the little tendrils of inspiration and enterprise that actually turn into very significant cultural exports, as well as pieces of culture that are very, very meaningful. So the cores should be seen in that context. And because of the way the cores looked, and because they were sold on their looks to a large extent, a lot of the promotion was based on the way they appeared. I think there was a genuine surprise when they turned out to be such consummate musicians. And from all of the evidence, they turned out to be really good, ordinary people who were enjoying getting an opportunity to play music. They weren't divas, they weren't untouchable, and they were happy to roll up their sleeves and to entertain people even when there were, technical failures, as happened famously in Australia, where the soundboard failed, and they said, "Well, sure, that doesn't matter to us. We're used to we can play without that," and that really endeared them to people in Australia, which became a key market, because I think that it was assumed when they were signed into the Warner organization in New York that they'd be huge. And the money spent on them was the type of budget you would spend on a band that's going to be huge quickly. And if you don't see a return on that, the record labels get a little bit twitchy. And it's very, very interesting that the cores were able to find supporters in places like Australia, in places like Spain, continental Europe, before they were very, very big in the States. And I would argue that they're still not superstars in the States. And clearly Ireland, they broke big there. And then Britain was a huge, huge triumph. And they were one of the biggest selling artists of their era in Britain, even though they were signed to the US part of the label. And I mentioned the word dangerous with that case study. I hope that an Irish band or a band from any other country who didn't find instant success on a major label in the States, I hope that they would still be nurtured the way the cores were, with clearly the eventual huge financial success. But I don't think that a band would receive that sort of assistance from a major label.
Yeah.
And I think to get to the major label's attention in the first place, the DIY in Ireland, because the music industry in Ireland didn't acknowledge them. And it was through, famously through Bill Whelan brought like the American ambassador to come and see this band. And the record labels based in Dublin didn't even bother to go to the gig that had been organised for them to see the band. And then they got to play in Washington, and they got a bit of political, the Irish American lobby. Uh, they're not afraid of supporting Irish product that they think is cool or different or represents something to them. And then that bounced back to build up the story. But the cores are an example where the Irish music scene, the DIY, the help, the strange, ordinary things that where you're not under contract, that really helped the cores. Whereas there's no evidence that the Irish music industry helped them until they actually had a record deal from an American label. So again, you're seeing that vacuum that exists where we don't have Irish record labels that support Irish bands and then export them successfully.
Yeah, and in relation to that, I think you also stress in the book somewhere else that, and maybe it's a characteristic of the digital age, the concentration of capital, that maybe European or UK acts are less of a percentage on the American billboard now than they were even 10 years ago. And that might be an unfortunate development, but on the other hand, the next chapter is dedicated to Riverdance, creating a kind of an showcase for Irish culture to the world. And I think, when I read the chapter and the fact that the show originally was presented for the Eurovision, I was thinking, is Riverdance a bit like the Red Army Choir production? For the face of the Irish state in a way abroad, because in a way that's what it became. Not really, it became something that it wasn't at the start. Basically, I think it was it changed its purpose, and that was something that became very popular in the States, in the USA and worldwide. But anyway, I'd like you to retrace the development of Riverdance, because I think it's a kind of a semi-state enterprise in Ireland.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. That Riverdance, to an extent, becomes representative of the Irish state abroad. Because people make their impressions on, you famously loved Sean Casey, so you wanted to see where he came from and what inspired him. And, you ended up with a life that pivoted because there was an element of Irish culture that was very attractive to you. So I think I love that, your notion that Riverdance represents the Irish state, but let's twist that into the enterprise, because I'm looking at the enterprise rather than the music, or the artistic development of these projects. If the enterprise of Riverdance represents the Irish state, the message is that a married mother on a career break who was ambivalent about doing, being the director of the Eurovision Song Contest, was persuaded by her own artistic drive and by the freedom of expression that was given to her by the national broadcaster. So it's an extraordinary story, and I like that idea that like the Red Army Choir, that these products then go around the world, and if they're enjoyed by people, if they find an audience, even if it's subliminal, it's going into your collection of impressions of that particular country. But Riverdance came from the mind of a mother who was given an opportunity and took it. And it wasn't that the Eurovision was particularly great that year, or that it was a high point in popular culture, or that anyone who's not a Eurovision obsessive could name, the top 10 artists in that. But the long-term success was Riverdance, which was designed to entertain people while the votes were being tabulated. It was that small an element. And no one thought this is going to be a commercial triumph. This will be one of Ireland's biggest cultural exports. But it was absolutely fueled by Moira Doherty's interest and expertise. We had women in Ireland at that time who had the expertise, who had the vision to come up with something that wasn't just a great way to pass a bit of time while the votes were being collected, but it was the foundation for an incredibly successful economic as well as cultural export. And, you know, there were strands that made up Riverdance, and there were parts of expertise that were being gathered by Bill Whelan, who did the music. And don't forget, this wasn't a dance show. Like, most people will think of it as a dance show, but it's a music show with dance. And I think that's really important. And, you know, at Riverdance, the musicians were part of the show. They were visible. They weren't in the orchestra pit, or they weren't on a DAT tape that you press play and, you know, it's just all about the dancers. So it's extraordinary in that music was a major driver of it. That was Moya Doherty and her husband and Bill Whelan together were able to do something that I argue in the book that Disney couldn't have done, that Sony couldn't have done. And if they could, well, why didn't they? If there was a project that could generate over $1 billion, because, you know, according to my calculations now, not all of that would have flowed to Ireland, but it's generated as a cultural product, and any cultural product that generates over $1 billion, it should be studied, should be understood, and the lessons should be learned of it. So the lessons from Riverdance are that without being full-time people devoted to a single project, all the elements of Riverdance were gathered in Ireland. And the show then was able to be exported. And it built up in stages. And a lot of those stages had major jeopardy. And a lot of those stages tell us something about Ireland and the Irish, not from the show, but from the enterprise behind it. When it was eventually released on DVD, no, it was pre-DVD, it was on VHS cassette. And it was a huge selling video cassette. And it was a fundraiser for Rwanda, you know, for aid to Rwanda. Again, if this project had been designed by Sony or Disney, that's not what they would have done when they took it to the market to sell the physical product, the DVD or the VHS. And then there's the question of, okay, it worked really well as a piece of television. Would it work in a different way? And the idea was floated that it would be a special. That let's make it bigger and longer and a bit more, maybe inject a bit of variety into it, and it would be a fabulous Christmas special. But Moya Doherty, you know, the team Doherty and Bill Whelan thought, actually, this could be a live stage show. And they had the expertise again in Ireland because of that flow, that curious flow. I know it's upsetting when our favourite bands don't play in Ireland because they're too busy being acclaimed elsewhere. But visiting bands, the presence of the major labels isn't all bad. Like, I wouldn't want people to read Jim and myself's book and think, okay, local, good, DIY, good, all the other stuff, evil, the evil empire. You know, it's got its benefits if you learn the lessons, if you're studying it. And Riverdance then went from being a live show with a good bit of financial jeopardy when it was put on in the Point Theatre, and it then became an exportable product. And boy, did that work. And, you know, it was so successful that there were eventually 3 groups able to tour and practice. So it's absolutely a cultural idea that became a cultural business that really became a cultural industry. Like, I think that commercialization of Irish dancing, and by the way, the diva in it is Michael Flatley, who decides that he wants more out of it, and then he sets up his own show and it becomes a duopoly. So out of this woman, a mom, a stay-at-home mom, when she got the offer of doing producing, directing Riverdance, the Eurovision that Riverdance came out of, that two huge cultural exports come out of this woman's idea.
And really, I think Riverdance highlights the last couple of chapters, the chapters 11 and 12, which is the importance of television for the development of Irish music industry, and how somebody like Louis Walsh, again, somebody who you wouldn't really associate with DIY. I think you use the word, the word is Svangali. When people talk about Louis Walsh and Boyzone, there's always a kind of, an element of, we think about maybe fakeness, and not at all. Not at all. These are really hardworking people, and who really basically took advantage of the stage, what televisions meant at that stage for Irish and British audiences. So Boyzone, I was looking at what you were saying, and I was saying, could this be a recipe for low-cost marketing? Could this be a model for low-cost marketing? Because you actually said that the band, basically to put them in place, it cost them 52,000 pounds sterling, which is not a very large amount of money considering the revenue this band generated. So yes, maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about Louis Walsh expertise in this area.
Well, our boy bands, which were incredibly successful as exports. Now, America, again, it's interesting that America wasn't that receptive to our boy bands. There are probably reasons for that. The American audience demands a certain type of presentation that I think Boyzone and later Westlife didn't have. But they were incredibly successful pretty much everywhere else, incredibly successful in Asia, in continental Europe, in Britain. But, this idea that's very interesting that you mentioned the word fakeness, that, sometimes these bands are seen as, they're fake because they're manipulated, and they're just designed by someone who knows how to manipulate an audience. But behind Boyzone and behind Westlife, there was a lot of hard graft by young people who just had an idea that I'd love to be famous. I'd love to be on stage. I'd love people to see me. I might have something to offer. I might have the background, the skills, the drive, the enterprise to get myself noticed, with the intention of later signing a record deal. And because of the nature of the relationship between music and television, which changes, it fluctuates. They've gone back to the early 1980s, MTV comes along, and it completely transformed the landscape. Bands that had an image, bands that had a good video, tended to thrive. Bands that were no longer dependent on radio. So it was that era of image rock, and very, very innovative. So sometimes bands that may not have been live acts could have a huge hit in the States. So that was a really interesting time. And then MTV loses its influence as a tastemaker in the music industry because it leverages what the gifts it's got from the music industry, free videos, access to bands, and then it goes into reality TV. But the idea of reality TV then comes back into the music industry in a different way, with the talent shows, with the X Factor, with Britain's Got Talent. And it's really, really important to acknowledge that someone like Louis Walsh, who didn't have the funds, didn't have the reputation, didn't have the contacts in Britain to make it at that moment, he was able to leverage the skills, reputation, history that he had in the Irish music industry to get a deal, to find a partner with a major label that was based in Dublin at that time. And that's really important. And he was very, very clear from the get-go, this was an Irish Take That. Take That were huge and have continued. And it'll be interesting to think about how much money have Take That and everything that spiraled from Take That, how much has that generated for the British economy? We were absolutely not in the boy band game at that moment. We had the Bachelors in the 1960s who were kind of a man boy band, a cover band, got to number one in Britain, so they were very significant, but we didn't have anything in terms of the, what's seen as the classic all singing, all dancing, all smiling, charismatic boy band. And it was because of a guy called Paul Keogh was the Polygram representative, and he just thought, you know what, this could work. And he'd come from a background of working in the alcohol industry, and he had famously given out a whole load, allegedly, a container's worth of free beer at the Trinity Ball. He parked the van and pretended that it was left unlocked by accident. And what are students going to do with an unlocked van full of beer? They're going to take it. And Budweiser had been seen, according to his recollection, as a kind of a cheap, weak beer. And he thought, if I can get a whole load of people waking up after the Trinity Ball with hangovers from drinking Budweiser, it can change the perception. And, allegedly, he felt that happened. So he's bringing that type of savvy. And Louis Walsh is bringing a long career into show bands, but also a huge love of soul music. We sometimes pigeonhole people in their lane. Okay, he's from a show band, so he must like Big Tom and country music. But maybe there's more to them. Maybe they're just pragmatic. So they think, okay, the show band genre tolerates this amount of innovation, so I'll just keep doing that. But he was able to bring a lifetime of that kind of hand-to-hand combat that DIY activity entails. And then Polygram Ireland funded it, and then Polygram in Britain, who you would think would be very, very thankful, they were really upset. And Polygram Ireland and Louis Walsh funded some activity in Britain to establish Boyzone, because Polygram in the UK, in their own market, wouldn't. And it was only when they became very, very popular that, that any of them were able to say, oh yeah, well done, Paul, thanks for doing that. Mm-hmm. But don't the implied was, don't do it again, because you're in Ireland, and the Irish people who work in the Irish offices for the major labels, you're just meant to sell Shakira records and Springsteen records. Your job is to market the products that we tell you to. It's not really to develop or nurture or invest in local talent. So again, Boyzone are probably the second most dangerous case study in there, because it probably can't be done now.
So when you ask the question in this chapter of Ireland's pop position at the epicenter or periphery of the pop industry, I was reminded of Asterix fighting the Romans with his matching potion. And so, yeah, I know you mentioned the Corrs and Boyzone, like they're the dangerous cases. Boyzone successes, Westlife, it begs the question, can you actually apply a recipe? Is there a recipe to this? Can the same thing work the same twice? And I think I'm not sure about this because I'm not familiar with these institutions, but there's plenty of training courses now in Ireland, which, the purpose of which is to train. Because, obviously, rock music has become something which is really strong, and people can now train as musicians and band managers and so on in various institutions in Dun Laoghaire or BIMM and so on. So, and I think a few members of the Fontaines band come from the BIM Institute. But anyway, in the case of Westlife, were they the true successors? Did they do the same thing as Boyzone? You know, was their success inspired by Boyzone and so on? And how did it work out for them? Because I think it turned out very differently for them.
I love your idea of Asterix de Gaul, that the Irish music industry is like Asterix de Gaul. And, instead of a disciplined, trained large army trying to repel the Romans, that the lesson in Asterix is that it's the magic potion, it's the wiliness, it's the imagination that can combat a militaristic, large, dominant force. So maybe that's a lovely way to look at the moments in the Irish music industry, where the Irish music industry, with its magic potion and its agility and its imagination, like Asterix, has been able to make a really, really deep and lasting impression. And I think that your point about Westlife, could Westlife have happened without Boyzone? We don't know that. That's conjecture, but I absolutely would be making the claim based on the research, based on what actually happened, that it couldn't have happened, that Westlife really were propelled by the experience of Boyzone, by the lessons learned, because it was the same people in terms of Louis Walsh being involved. But you mentioned, when you were talking about Boyzone, the importance of television. Louis Walsh is becoming a bigger and bigger cultural figure throughout this period. So when he says a band is good, a band is valid, that he should be listened to, when he's got a vision for a band, he's got the stature, he's got the platform. So that I hadn't thought until you said that of how the boy bands were really television bands. They take television out of the equation and it's completely different. But obviously there's a far more sophisticated infrastructure available to Louis Walsh. He's got a reputation because he's delivered one successful boy band. And the Louis Walsh model and the lesson from Louis is, if you get one away, there's a good chance you can get a second away. And then the bigger question is, well, then what happened with Jedward? How come they weren't as big as the others? So you get one away, there's a good chance you'll get the second one away. But there might have been a lot of luck, a lot of timing. And then one of your points, I think, invites me to want to say that the music industry is constantly changing. So the model that works at one stage may not work a year later or 10 years. But the nugget of the idea, the approach, the vision might very well work, because the music industry has no memory. I think the music industry, a generation in the music industry to me is 4 years. It's the amount of time that you're at university. You go into university, you have a certain music taste. It might be different by the time you graduate. And it might be very intense, but if you're lucky, maybe it's the music that you like for the rest of your life. But it may change and may evolve. And certainly the memory of what happened, even for the participants, when you're first year in university, that knowledge isn't available to the people who enter 4 years later. Because the other people have gone, or they're too busy to explain what they did. So the Boyzone to Westlife is really interesting, because Westlife become a much bigger global sensation. And then the solo careers, again, become very, very lucrative cultural products for us. If we own the publishing, an Irish entity, if we own the record rights, Irish entity, the money would be would make a substantial difference to Ireland's exchequer. But we're not set up to do that. And, the fact that, you had a member of Boyzone involved in the management of Westlife, and, clearly, okay, we've got a rock star. He's telling us what to do, so we'll do it. But I think you can't remove from that story just how significant a figure Louis was globally at that stage, and how influential he was. But then when you peel it back, the guys in Westlife, they're grown up in Sligo, and they do a huge amount of the graft, of the early work themselves, in a place that's not, it's not South Central. It's not Maida Vale. It's not the Sorbonne. These were young guys who had a hunger and ambition, who clearly had some talent, and they were able to achieve a huge amount. And, I get people all the time saying, oh, I want to be in a boy band, or I want to be a rock star. What you do? And, I say, study the first 18 months of Green Day's history. Look at their tour dates. Look where they went. Imagine how much they were getting paid. Look at the early media. And the same for anyone who wants to be a pop star is study what the guys, including the guy who then got kicked out, what the guys in Westlife did before they got a manager. Study that. And if you're not working that hard or that intelligently or with that amount of savviness, then, the Bank of Ireland's probably a good place to send your CV.
Yeah. You end your book with a special chapter about the role of graphic arts in the selling of music. And in the case of the Irish scene, there's an artist that seems to have crossed many decades of success, and that's Steve Averill. We just mentioned him a little earlier on. Quite the Renaissance man, really, who namely worked with U2 and the Virgin Prunes, but not just. And I think we all know the particular relationship that the two bands enjoyed at the beginning of their career. But Steve Averill is lesser known, but a key figure. And why?
Steve Averill is so important to the development and the success of the Irish music industry that if you took him out, if he was absent from that history, if he didn't exist and didn't participate the way he did, we would have a much, much lesser industry. He was a guy who was obsessed with music and visuals. And he followed that obsession for years. Now, it must have given him a lot of personal satisfaction, but it was of huge benefit. I think we as a nation, we actually haven't processed how much we owe to Steve Averill in terms of his contribution on a many, many, many different aspects of our cultural life. He's important for being a founder member of the Radiators from Space, of doing their graphic design, of doing such impressive graphic work that when Chiswick Records, founded by two Irish guys in London, when they get the Chiswick received the demo tape from, I believe, from Eamon Carr of Horselips, of the Radiators. They thought, that's okay, but the artwork's incredible. So let's go deeper into it. And then he mentored, we talked in the U2 section about, he had an open door in his house to Adam Clayton when Adam Clayton was thinking, how do I get people to notice our band? So he's sitting down and his wife is giving coffee to this young schoolboy, certainly of schoolboy age, even if he wasn't going to school every day. So he's transferring all of the knowledge that he has from being in the Radiators, but also from being an active member of the music community. He starts a fanzine, like one of the first punk fanzines, if not the first punk fanzine, Raw Power. And Raw Power was an invitation to everyone just to do it themselves. It's got the absolute key message of punk rock and DIY and the type of entrepreneurship that we saw with Ellen O'Byrne when Irish people had no money, and then with Horselips
Oh, slips, yeah.
You know, Steve is absolutely putting out that seed and promoting it and publicizing it and making it look good. He famously said, you know, does anyone want to be in an all girl band? You know, this is a guy. So it's like, oh, is that mansplaining? Is that, you know, patronizing? And women wrote in saying, I'd love to be in an all girl band. And he said, well, I took out the ad, and there's the other people who responded. So form a band. And, you know, famously, they were called the Boy Scouts. With his ad, brilliant. And a really important moment for that punk scene that was underdeveloped in Ireland was the fact that there was at least one all-female band, which you didn't have in the North or in some other scenes. So he was there mentoring, but not pushing. I think he set up U2's first photo session. He certainly got them to change their name from the hype. I think he designed their first poster, and then he got involved with every element of their visual representation, which, you know, some people don't like U2, but if anyone can fault their visual representation, then I'd like to hear from them, because I think it's flawless and imaginative and interesting. And then he's doing the Virgin Prunes. And, you know, the Prunes, for anyone who was young at the time where the Prunes were making music, there was nothing like that anywhere in Irish culture. Like, there was nothing like that in any visiting band coming to Ireland. They were staggering. And maybe you think, okay, so Steve Averill was a great graphic designer, so of course he wanted to do the U2 stuff because they were famous, but he was putting as much effort and ingenuity into the Virgin Prunes as he was into U2, and they both, again, flawless visual presentation.
Yeah.
And then he, you know, DC9, who were the great should have been of that Irish punk into post-punk scene. You know, he was involved, he was helping them. He had a series. He was one of the early champions of electronica in Ireland, because he started reviewing the electronica bands for Hot Press. And he just has had this legacy. There's like the Mother Records bands, loads and loads of interesting stuff. And that's a legacy. But what isn't a legacy is all the conversations he's having, encouraging bands, mentoring them, helping them without getting any acknowledgement, or even, he'd probably be embarrassed to hear me talking about him like this. So central figures, and I think our musicians, to me, are world beaters. Our enterprise of music is incredibly, incredibly low. I think it's huge. It's an embarrassment how little music enterprise. But the music enterprise that has occurred over that 120-year period is staggering. But it's driven by individuals rather by institutions. And our artwork is absolutely top of the world. I'll challenge any other country, you know, to show me as many great. And Steve Averill is at the forefront of that. But then you've got people like Niall McCormack, you've got people like Boz Mugabe, you've got really, really Brian Crosby that I mentioned, the cover that his mother helped him with for the Cake Sale benefit album. So Lisa Hannigan, the Irish artists who then get involved in their own desire, in their own design, that's incredibly important. So I think our legacy of music industry artwork, to me, it's second to none. I'll put it up against anyone's.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. And we I think we have a huge panorama of the Irish music industry. And I mean, I think we could have talked for another 6 hours, to be honest, because we just skirted the ideas that are in your book, which, you know, you can all get at equinoxpub.com. And the book is called Sounds Irish, Acts Global. Thank you very much, Michael, and I hope we'll have you on the show again very soon for another topic.
Thanks a million. What a pleasure. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.